when I look at that tree in the lower part of the frame, I feel like I have some definition, right?
Mm-hmm.
I can see the little pine cone deals. So if I'm gonna look at the Viper and the Razor, yeah, I mean I don't know what the hell the difference is.
Morning, guys. We got 3 Vortex spotting scopes up here today, the Diamondback, Viper, and Razor HD. We're basically just trying to figure out what the difference is between the 3 of them on a side-by-side comparison. Thus far, honestly, I've been pretty impressed with where the Viper comes in, not surprisingly. But Diamondback to Viper, there's a pretty clear difference. I don't know, what do you think, Viper to Razor?
Viper to Razor in these conditions, surprisingly, seems minimal.
Yeah.
So for those on a budget, there's something to be had in the Viper.
Definitely. But we've got the all-in adapters on all of these. So we're gonna have some digiscope footage that we can just compare side by side for the rest of this video and honestly let you guys kind of be the judge here. So we'll get a little more footage and let you guys take a look. Before we get started, I want to point out that the comparison footage is taken with manual focus, exposure, and white balance settings on my phone. I also did my best to get each scope focused before setting the phone on it. That being said, these tests are not perfect, and your real-world results may vary. So here's our first example. In this one, I want you guys to look at the brush underneath the tree and the texture on the big rock here. This was taken at mid to low light, and as you can see, it's actually difficult to tell a difference between the resolution of the Viper and the Razor. The Diamondback is obviously much murkier. Throughout this test, I was constantly surprised by the quality of the Viper. That being said, the Viper didn't seem to have the same level of contrast as the Razor. In this particular example, the Viper may seem sharper, but if you look at the details of the tree bark and smaller branches, you'll actually see a slightly higher resolution in the Razor, but it's, not that much, which really did surprise me. For this next example, I wanted to showcase contrast. Notice the brightness of the background compared to the tree. Both the Diamondback and Razor actually have higher contrast than the Viper here. The shadows in the tree also make that very clear. As far as details go, the Viper and Razor are actually quite similar once again. The main difference being your ability to differentiate lights and darks and understand the depth of the image. Now for the test that everyone likes to talk about, this was in considerably low light, and there's a few key things I want you to look at. First off, light transmission is actually pretty similar for all 3 of these scopes, which really did surprise me. However, I quickly learned that light transmission is not everything. Look at the Diamondback first. You've got a lot of murky looking details and lines that are not very defined. The Viper clears this up fantastically, but sharpness isn't everything either. Compare the Viper to the Razor and you'll see that the Razor image looks much more 3-dimensional than the Viper. Shadows are darker and highlights are brighter, allowing you to see through thicker cover and decide if it's a rock or an animal. Also, if you look at the background, you will notice a easier landscape to pick apart due to both exposure contrast and color contrast. That being said, if you look at the telephone pole, the Viper seems to hold details better than the Razor. At first I thought my focus was off, but the trees in the Razor seem to be sharper than the trees in the Viper. The best conclusion I can make from this image and the first image is that the Viper actually shows texture better than the Razor in some scenarios. And these images prove my last point. The Viper seems to display textures better than the Razor in full daylight as well. Look at the blades of grass here. The Diamondback doesn't show them at all. The Viper shows them well, but the Razor seems to blur the grass more than the Viper. Also look at the details in the ground. The Viper gives an easier image to understand what the ground actually looks like. So at first glance, the Viper is sharper, right? But now you look at the dead tree. So imagine an elk standing in front of it and you're trying to judge his score. I think you'll find it easier to see him through the Razor simply due to higher contrast. Obviously the Diamondback gives you a much muddier image compared to these other 2 high quality scopes. Now, I did talk to Vortex and ask them if I was crazy for thinking that the Viper was sharper than the Razor, and they said not exactly. The Razor does still objectively have a higher resolution, but the Viper has a lot of different things that make it really close in sharpness to the Razor in almost every condition. However, like I've mentioned a couple times, sharpness isn't everything, clarity isn't everything, contrast matters a lot, and that's kind of where the Viper falls short in my opinion, is contrast. In a lot of conditions, the Viper's image looks very two-dimensional when you compare it to the Razor, which gives a lot of depth to the image in shadows and highlights, and obviously just a higher contrast. One last thing to look at here is the chromatic aberration. That's going to be the rainbows along the edges of different items here, and that is just a lens defect that's going to come through more in lesser quality glass. On this example, I wanted to show a high contrast scenario with the snow in the background, and I was very surprised by two things. First off, the Diamondback seems to come out of nowhere with an impressively sharp and readable image. This caught me off guard considering that the previous example and this example were shot at the same time of day and very close together. So even like the light was at a similar angle. There's very few differences here. It just happens that the Diamondback really shone on this particular example. Now, obviously, these shots are middle of the day. There's going to be a ton of heat waves, and even the nicest glass can't fix atmospheric distortion. So those heat waves are just going to be part of the game. Now, back to the Diamondback image, the contrast is good. And when comparing the tree in the Diamondback to the Razor, there's not near as much difference as I would have guessed, and not near as much difference as our previous examples. But then you look at the Viper, which has seemingly been the star of the show. It just really dropped the ball here. And I don't fully understand why, but the image is actually brighter and flatter than the other two. And I confirmed this with my natural eye as well, and found the Viper to be brighter in full daylight than the Razor, even though low light comparison showed a pretty similar brightness, if not a little more light transmission from the Razor. I'll also use these images to show difference in coloration. The Razor has a much more purple hue than the other two, and I'm sure you noticed that right off the bat. If you look at the colors of the sky and snow here, also look at the green in the tree in the lower right corner, and you'll notice a significant difference and overall a little more purple in the Razor's image. However, you'll also see a little more color contrast, so the Razor's going to let other colors come through a little bit more, whereas the Viper and Diamondback both seem to be kind of a flatter green coloration throughout. So that's what I'm talking about when I say color contrast. That may not be the proper term for it, but we're going with it. And then the last thing I want to mention is that if you're worried about the purple hue of the Razor, from my experience, your eye will adjust to coloration pretty quickly, just like a camera adjusts white balance for different light conditions. So when you're comparing them side by side, you can say, oh yeah, of course, that image is way too purple. But then when you're looking at it in person, you would never think that unless you went from the Razor to the Viper. And if you did that, you'd probably see the Viper and think, wow, this image is way too green. You just got to give your eye a little time to adjust to those colors. And what you really want to be looking for when purchasing a scope is color contrast, not so much color hue. It can make a difference, but I don't think it's near as important as color contrast. So this is our last example. Both the Diamondback and Viper go to 20, but I set those at 27 as close as I could, simply to show the difference in exit pupil, or size of the circle that you look through. So on paper, these three scopes should have the exact same size exit pupil, since the zoom and objective lenses, being 85 millimeters, are the same. So I contacted Vortex, and they said this was actually a side effect of optical design. They put different field stops in the Viper to remove optical imperfections such as chromatic aberration at the cost of a slightly smaller field of view. In their words, everything is a trade-off when it comes to optical design. You don't get something for nothing, and vice versa. One more thing to talk about on this example is edge-to-edge clarity. In my opinion, this should be a fairly small factor when considering a scope. Yes, it matters, but the reality is you will always have your sharpest image in the center of the scope. The blurriness on the edges is mostly due to a difference in focus, so you can actually pull those edges into focus if you really want to. Now, this example isn't a great one to look at edge-to-edge clarity, and I say that because when you look at the Viper's image in the center, you can see the bottom of the scope has better edge clarity than the top, and that is likely due to the phone having a slight angle from the all-in adapter and therefore changing the focus plane ever so slightly. So use caution when looking at digiscope footage to see edge-to-edge clarity. That being said, the Razor did seem to have a narrower margin for perfect clarity than the other two. Now, as you just saw, these scopes look pretty similar on the outside, but on the inside there's a ton of differences. Everything from quality and pureness of the glass to the coatings they put on it, to how flat the prism reflective surface is. One last thing to mention is that these two are made in China, whereas the Razor is made in the USA. So keep that in mind. If you are looking to purchase one of these scopes, you can find us at gearful.com. We'll be able to help you out. And if you got any questions or real world experience that you'd like to share, just leave it down in the comments. Thanks for watching, guys.